Welcome everybody. So glad to have you. I see there's about 85 people on the call now. So I'm William Masters. I'm a board member of CFAIR, the Council on Food and Agricultural and Resource Economics. I've been really happy to be able to organize this series of 3 webinars on food security. Our first one with Sarah Bleich and Norbert Wilson happened in October. You can see the recording on the CFAIR website about US food insecurity. And today we're going to talk about global food security, take stock of what we've learned, understand how it's measured, how it's understood, and what we can do about it. And we have an all-star group for you, Yacob Zereyesus, Maximo Torero, Saskia de Pee, and Rob Bertram. Next. I want to just share a little bit about why we're here. So the mission of CFAIR, as you might know, is to take stock of knowledge, to translate research-based knowledge, and to make it useful for governance, for government in the United States, for congressional staff, for people working on the Hill on behalf of American civil society interest groups, stakeholders of all kinds, and agency staff, as well as stakeholders directly. So we're keen to hear from you in the Q&A section of the session of the GoToWebinar platform. You can enter comments, questions under the questions tab, and we'll get those on the agenda for this group to talk about. Next. Next slide, please. And the overall situation here, next slide, please. Is to get a sense from each of these experts, what they know, what they work on, what they've contributed to this dialogue. I was astonished when all 4 of them said, yes, we definitely want to speak to this group, for you to hear from them directly and to have your questions in the chat box. So Yacob will go first, as you can see from the description, providing the US government's official assessments that he'll tell you about. Next. Then we'll have the leader of this effort for the UN system agencies, particularly the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, that produces the authoritative measures of food security around the world that inform the coordinated efforts of all governments to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And next, we'll have Saskia de Pee, who has been the longtime leader of interventions to do something about food security. The world's largest humanitarian organization is the World Food Program, and she leads its analytics group that tries to figure out what are the best interventions in each time, in each place, as crises unfold. So you can imagine this is a combination of climate-induced extreme weather events, natural disasters, but also conflict-related crises. And the WFP is the largest and heavily supported by the United States in responding on the front lines. And Saskia has been the leader in making sure that those responses attend to people's nutritional needs, as she'll share. And the next slide gives us the story of Rob Bertram, who has been the longtime leader of USAID's efforts to take federal resources through the whole of government Feed the Future effort with taxpayer funds to respond in ways that are going to build resilience in the long run. So he'll tell you about being able to escape crises and not have to need necessarily the assistance that WFP provides. So we'll get the full picture from this group of 4 and hear from you in the Q&A. So next slide, please. It should be clear from your GoToWebinar interface how to just type a question, a comment, and then I'll be able to see those and bring them forward to the group. And then be aware that you can also be in contact with us directly. So my email address, very straightforwardly, my name, william.masters@tufts.edu. You can also write to information@cfair.org and after the event, but certainly to hear from you now through the GoToWebinar question that you see in front of you here. Next. So we can dive right in to hear first from Yacob about the federal government's monitoring of the global food security situation.
All right, thanks, Will. We can have the slide. All right, thank you. So my name is Yacob Zereyesus, an economist with USDA's Economic Research Service. I would first like to thank CFAIR for the work you do and for organizing this event, and particularly to you, Will, Gal, as well as Lisa for inviting us and coordinating all this. And I also would like to express my delight to join such a distinguished panel and share an overview of how USDA measures food security from a global perspective and how the data are used in Congress and elsewhere. So next slide. So here's how I organized my remark, and I'd like to touch 4 points here. And first, I will provide an overview of the International Food Security Assessment that we also like to call the IFSA report, by highlighting the countries included in the report, as well as the population coverage. I'll then define food security and its relevant dimensions. And I will then talk about why we care about tracking international food security from a global perspective, and then finish by summarizing how our data are used to inform decision making. So next slide, please. So the IFSA, or the International Food Security Assessment, is USDA's ERS annual outlook report on food availability and access for up to 10 years out. And this normally follows the USDA's agricultural projections. The report includes 77 low and middle income countries that have recent or ongoing food deficits. Of course, not all countries experiencing significant food deficits are included in the report, mainly due to data shortage on key metrics, for example, average caloric consumption, price, or macroeconomic figures. We cover 4 regions with a total population of a little over 4 billion people. 39 countries are found in the sub-Saharan Africa. 23 countries are found in Asia. 11 countries are in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the remaining 4 are in North Africa. Next slide. So when we talk about food security in the IFSA report, we are referring to the ability of all people at all times to have both physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs, as well as food preference for an active and healthy life. This is a definition that was developed at the World Food Summit back in 1996. Next slide, please. So in this regard, as I mentioned, based on the definition, there are 4 pillars that constitute the food security are the following. First one is the availability, access, utilization, and stability. So for example, the availability pillar implies having sufficient quantity of appropriate food that includes domestic production, import capacity, food stocks, and food aid. The access pillar refers to both physical and economic access to food, and is mainly determined by income as well as purchasing power of households, and it's ensured when both individuals and our households have adequate resources to obtain appropriate food. The third pillar, which is utilization, includes adequate dietary intake and ability to use nutrients in the body. And finally, the stability pillar refers to the stability of both supply and access, and is ensured when there is consistent access to food. And of course, this depends on the maintenance of the 3 pillars over time. Next slide, please. So why does USDA focus on food security? So in general, the United States leads efforts to improve global food security, and that includes the provision of the bulk of the global food aid and humanitarian assistance. And ending global food insecurity and hunger is among the greatest challenges and opportunities of our time. But even beyond the humanitarian response, and particularly for USDA, it's important to assess where and how global food demand is changing, and that's mainly to identify where the potential emerging markets for US farmers are and understanding what the potential drivers of side trends are. But not only that, it's also important to address, as we'll discuss later, maybe the root cause of chronic food insecurity and the occurrence of potential hotspots. And specifically, we'd like to address how income and prices would affect food. And before I move to the next slide, I would like to mention that the report that we cover focus on the availability and access dimensions of food security. Next slide, please. So, international food security assessment. The IFSA framework is, as I mentioned, used to evaluate food security at a country level. And in doing so, the following points are worth mentioning. So the first one, the approach we use responds to change both to price and income, mainly to capture the access to food. And it also captures the contribution of income to food insecurity, income inequality to food insecurity. I'd like to pause here and highlight that this is particularly important for our assessment because lower income consumers spend a greater share of their expenditure on food, and also that price sensitivity and income responsiveness decline with income levels. And in some cases, we do make adjustments to both the per capita income as well as real prices. That's mainly meant to account for any external shocks that may happen. For example, such as what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian military invasion of Ukraine, and some other external shocks as well. Next slide, please. So in defining food security for our IFSA assessment, we use a caloric threshold of 2100 calories per capita per day. And based on this caloric threshold, we developed 3 indicators of food insecurity. And these are the first one is the prevalence of food insecurity, which is the share of the population that consumes less than the caloric threshold. The second one is the population food insecure, which also refers to the number of food insecure people. Often we measure this in millions. And the third one is the food gap, which measures the food needed to raise consumption at every income level to the caloric threshold. And for the IFSA Outlook report, which extends up to 10 years out, we do calibration based on trends observed in the last 3 years. Next slide. So the IFSA data serves those who routinely make or influence public policy and program decisions. And some of the key users of our data include the following. For example, USDA policy officials, the US Congress, other federal agencies, as well as state and local government officials. And we do also reach out to organizations, including farm and industry groups, media, researchers, and other interested who also use our data. Next slide. So in order to achieve our objectives, we release multiple research and data products, mainly to inform policy decision making. Some of the products that we release include the following. For example, the staff analysis and briefings, which are meant to inform policy decision makers on a timely basis by providing objective and relevant information, mostly on current and emerging food security issues. We do also conduct webinars and presentations. For example, shortly after we release the IFSA report, we conduct webinar to inform the public about our key results. And lastly, we also release data and publications. For example, the the IFSA result we released that in the Amber Waves magazine, as well as other agency peer-reviewed reports, including the IFSA Outlook report itself, and some other data and files that are also made available in the ERS websites. So with that, I think I will finish my remark here and look forward to the Q&A discussion. Next slide.
Super, perfect. Thank you. Perfect timing. Yes, thank you, Yacob. And so for the international counterpart of this, looking at this same question, but on behalf of the UN system agencies through the Food and Agricultural Organization, Maximo Torero has been leading this effort really as the global spokesperson for this kind of work, and the architect of what he'll describe is a really remarkable effort to understand the circumstances under which households live and their degree to which they can meet their food needs.
Thank you very much, Will, and it's a pleasure to be here. If we can share my slides, we will move a little bit fast so that I can meet the 8 minutes. So let's move to the next slide. And the next slide is basically why FAO is doing that. It's part of our constitutional mandate. We have started since its inception in 1945 with the setting up of the statistical division. And we have been the custodian of these indicators, initially with the World Food Summit, later on with the MDGs, and now with the SDGs, where we are custodian of all the indicators of food security. Next slide, please. Now, what I am trying to do is going to look at all the different indicators we're trying to bring up to monitor by FAO in a decentralized statistical system that we have in place. We have a nutrition division that handles all the food-based nutrition indicators, and we also have a trade division that looks into trade issues. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus only in the FAO indicators that we are using to track SDG 2 and also the IPC classification. Next slide, please. As it was presented before, the definition of food security is a complex phenomena from the conceptual point of view. It has 6 dimensions. There is one more dimension, 2 more dimensions that were added lately by the CFS. So the agency dimension, which means all people, the stability, short-term dimension, which is at all times, and the sustainability dimension. And we also have the access, availability, and utilization, as it was mentioned before. So food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Next slide, please. At the same time, the various elements that influence food security and nutrition operate at different but interrelated levels in a society, ranging from the more distal macro level to the immediate individual level. Macro level drivers contribute to shaping food systems at the meso level, and meso level systems include elements determined at the micro level. For example, the macro level infrastructure such as paved roads and environment or global climate change, for instance, affect national meso level food systems. That extends to the extent of paved roads influence how food is transported from place to place, and global climate change has a myriad ramifications for national environmental shifts through droughts and potential issues that could affect both the agricultural production and the relevant infrastructures, and also, of course, at the end will be affecting the individual level. In terms of elements determined at the micro level which impact the meso level, the most obvious example are the many actors involved in the food systems, from farmers and fisheries to intermediaries in charge of transport to vendors and big and small farmers. In the next slide, we will just see all the different indicators that we collect. If we can move to the next one. All the different indicators that we collect for both availability, stability, sustainability, access, utilization, and agency both at the distal, meso, and immediate level. And I will be touching in some of them only. Let me move to the next slide, please. Another important aspect is that food security can be seen in the long term and the development perspective, and from the short term and the contingency and emergency response perspective. For this, we recognize the need to collect evidence and inform the world in two complementary yet distinct distinctions. A highly simplified way to characterize the differences between these two perspectives and to understand the need for different approaches is to refer to chronic food insecurity and to acute food insecurity. In the next slide, if we can move to the next one, we show the latest results in having different types of food security assessments that pursue different objectives. And they result in different numbers, but at the same time, they are normally confused and not well understood by the international community. On one hand, chronic food insecurity is measured by indicators such as the prevalence of undernourishment, the POU, and the ones coming from the Food Insecurity Experience Scale that FAO produced and disseminates through the SOFI public report, and that serve as the basis for the SDG monitoring. On the other hand, acute food insecurity, the last report in the three I'm showing, is defined as an sporadic, sudden crisis that can limit people's access to food in the short term to the point that their lives and livelihoods are at risk, and is qualified following the IPC classification and reported in the Global Food Crisis Report. Next, please. Here in this slide, I show the reporting on chronic food insecurity and the SDGs, which is the SOFI report, and is the first UN report to be signed by 5 different agencies. It's an integrated view of food security. It corresponds to SDG Target 2.1 and nutrition SDG Target 2.2. And there are 7 different indicators, 2 by FAO, 5 by UNICEF and WHO. Next slide, please. And these are the 3 reports that we use to report acute recent food insecurity. The 2022 Global Report on Food Crisis. The second one is the hunger hotspots that we do jointly with WFP. And the third one is access to food in 2021, filling data gaps. And here is a result of 20 national surveys using the FIES analysis. Next slide, please. Let me now focus on the prevalence of undernourishment, the POU indicator. It's a long-established method to estimate the percentage of the population with sufficient caloric intake, integrating information from different sources: food availability, food access, population characteristics for dietary energy requirements, gender, age, and body mass. The prevalence of undernourishment, the POU, is the probability that a random chosen individual in the population is found to be consuming on a regular basis an amount of food that provides less than his or her own dietary energy requirements. It can be applied to any population for which there are sufficient data on the distribution of food consumption and on relevant characteristics of the population. Limitations of the POU include difficult to obtain very timely estimates, as the data of the DES and also food consumption surveys came with delays, and data cannot be disaggregated. And we have been doing an enormous effort to try to update this indicator to try to minimize these problems. In the next slide, we will see the distribution of that indicator and how we have been looking at hunger, which affected 46 million people in 2021 and in 2020, and a total of 150 million more people since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The estimates since the last 2 years or 3 years have been presented in intervals of confidence, because there has been an added uncertainty around the numbers induced by the COVID-19 pandemic, which continue to interfere, and that's why we continue to report this indicator in ranges. In the next slide, we look at the other indicator, which is referred to SDG 2.12, which is the FIES indicator. FIES came as a response of the need to obtain more timely, reliable, and actionable data on household food insecurity in a cost-effective manner, and also as a response of the more ambitious need for SDGs, where objectives were defined as global, not only for developing countries, and a need to disaggregate by subgroups of the population. It is based on anthropological studies that identify a sequence of experiences that characterizes food insecurity and that appear to be common across cultures. They start from least severe to more severe experiences. Considering this as a measuring tool was developed and is used by countries such as the USA, Canada, or Mexico to monitor food insecurity. FAO took advantage of this research to develop its own tool based on questionnaires with 8 questions and reference period of 12 months, in which individuals are asked by their experience towards access to food. A probability of being located beyond a given position on the scale of severity can be associated with each raw score, and prevalence rates can be obtained as weighted average probabilities in representative sample. The use of the RASH models make it possible to produce measures whose validity and reliability can be formally assessed. In the next slide, we see how we decompose this indicator. To have a global assessment across comparability is needed, and FAO has developed the global scale to which all scales can be equated to. And based on the scale, one can define different indicators of food insecurity that differ only on the level of severity, which are the thresholds that are being identified with the RASH model. Based on these 2 FIES indicators can be computed, which speak on the severity of food insecurity of the analyzed population, and this is the moderate food insecurity and the severe food insecurity. In the next slide, we see the evolution of these indicators, and we can see how it has been deteriorating over time, both in the case of the moderate and the severe food insecurity. And if we look at the next slide, we have also been doing an effort to try to bring this indicator at the subnational level. This is extremely important because also it's very helpful to quickly have an indicator that will allow us to target at the subnational level. FAO finally, in the next slide, has recovered what used to be our global map of food insecurity, and that's what we report. And finally, the last indicator, which you can see in the previous slide, can you go back one, please? Is what we called the IPC, which is the based on the Integrated Food Insecurity Phase Classification, the IPC. And protocols have been built on consensus among key stakeholders based on available secondary data. The IPC combine information coming from different indicators and different sources, compare them with a reference table which classified assessed populations in one of 5 phases. Acute food insecurity based on the IPC is an assessment of crisis level food insecurity caused by sporadic sudden crises that can limit people's access to food in the short term, and this can put their lives and livelihoods at risk. The indicators, the FIES, the Household Dietary Diversity Score, the Food Consumption Score, and the Household Hunger Scale reduce the coping strategy index, and each phase entails a response that goes from building resilience, phase 1, protect livelihoods up to phase 3, and save livelihoods and lives, which are phase 4 and phase 5. I will stop here, so I keep more or less, I am already 2 minutes over, but it's important to understand that we are now expanding the IPC from 54 countries to around 80 countries, which is a huge effort that is being done, and I hope in the next year or 2 we can be able to achieve that goal. But at the end of the line, there are still significant gaps in terms of data that we need to look to be able to integrate all these indicators and to be able to compensate and comply with all the definition of food security. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Maximo. Thank you. And we can turn now to the agencies responsible for action, for intervention, for direct provision of assistance in the case of the World Food Program that we'll hear from first from Saskia de Pee, and then from Rob Bertram on the USAID investments in resilience. So Saskia?
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to participate in this webinar. So what Maximo showed, what guides WFP's response is the IPC classification. There's 349 million people who are in acute food insecurity today. And there's 49 million on the edge of famine in IPC 4. And around 900,000 actually in IPC 5. So that's in famine-like conditions. What I'll do in this presentation is I'll also really link in nutrition, which is part of the definition of food insecurity. It provides for nutritious food for a healthy life. If I can have the next slide. One of the other indicators in the SOFI report is the affordability of a healthy diet. What I'm showing you here is an analysis that we did together with colleagues from IFPRI and from Harvard and Tufts for 63 low-middle income countries prior to COVID and then in 2020 with COVID. And we assessed the affordability of a healthy diet. And we're showing that prior to COVID, only 30% of the population in those countries would be able to afford a healthy diet. And then with COVID, 26% would be able to afford a healthy diet. And then below that, you see the proportion that could afford between 75 and 100% of that level of cost. And then between 50 and 75, 25, 50, and 0 to 25. So what I want to emphasize here is that the extent of non-affordability, what proportion can you afford, that really affects the diet quantity and quality. So the severity of not being able to meet your needs increases when you can afford less, quite, as you would imagine. And so we're going to use that metric to then identify how can a response be most nutritious and best meet nutritional needs. So on the next slide, I'm showing you for Kenya, in Kisumu, a particular area of Kenya, the cost of a nutrient adequate diet for a household. So it's almost $100, 12,000 Kenyan shillings. And then you see the percentiles of the population by food expenditure. So the lowest decile, they can only afford less than half the cost of a nutritious diet. And that then increases. So the green part is what they can afford. And then you see in blue the amount of a child benefit grant. So expressed as how much that contributes to reducing the gap, which is the part in gray. So that child benefit contributes, but it doesn't contribute too much. So on the next slide, we really conceptualize in which ways can we improve access to better diets to meet nutritional needs and therefore health and human capital needs. So on the lower right, this is about increasing the availability of nutritious foods and lowering prices of nutritious foods. This can be with infrastructural measures, it can be with fertilizer measures, and it can be market interventions. Then to the left, it's about increasing the nutritional value of food, and this is largely through fortification. This can be biofortification, can be post-harvest fortification. Then to the top left, of course, increasing incomes and therefore ability to afford or spend more on food and on nutritious food. And to the right, top specific interventions for more vulnerable groups to kind of top up what the household has so that these individuals better meet their needs. And I'm going to show some examples on the next slides of that. On the next slide, here you see that same grant in Kenya, now showing it as the cost of meeting the needs of a child, 700 Kenyan shillings per month. So that's around $6. So it's a small proportion of that household. And then you see in all the next bars, they get the same amount of cash, but they change what is being spent on. So the more nutritious the items, you get more value for money. So this is about stimulating what to better purchases for better nutrition. So that's one way. Within the means that you have, make better choices. Next one. So it's of course also necessary that the food environment then does provide for better choices. So here's an example where we've modeled if you provide a fresh food voucher in addition, and that fresh food voucher is specifically for more nutritious vegetables, for some animal source foods, then you can stimulate the demand side, and therefore that demand side can also stimulate the supply side. So this is a modeled additional measure. And these are all examples that we provide to stakeholders to see what all could be done to maximize the nutritional impact and lower food insecurity. Next one. And here we're showing a targeted complementary food supplement for children. So you see the child's cost per day on this one. And you see different interventions, how it lowers the cost that remains for the household. So this is with a micronutrient powder, or a small lipid-based supplement. And you can see it depends on the age group how much it can contribute. And this basically says you can have your social protection intervention and now add another intervention from the health sector, and cumulatively you can make a bigger difference. Next one. It's an example from Indonesia. This is the cost for a household, and that household receives social protection assistance, and they spend it on a diverse package of foods, which lowers their cost of a nutritious diet. And now, same cost with the rice that they get as part of that as well, being fortified, you reduce the cost further. So this is all about getting more nutritional value for the money. And that requires now food system interventions to ensure that you can make the most of your resources. One more example. On the next slide, yeah, on this slide, thank you. So this is for humanitarian assistance. There is assistance to households, and that only goes so far, also because of the cost. And then we like to top it up for specific vulnerable individuals, which can be in the form of cash, but it can also be a voucher, and it can also be specialized nutritious foods. And of course, that would be combined with social and behavior change, as well as with screening. So those that have developed malnutrition, they will be supported further. So my conclusions on the next slide. So to enable a nutrition-sensitive design of household assistance, humanitarian assistance, as well as social protection, we really need to estimate the cost of a nutrient-adequate diet and measure the magnitude of that affordability gap, doing that subnationally and across seasons and for different groups across the life cycle. And it's clear that the affordability gap is large relative to transfers that are provided. Also, household food assistance doesn't necessarily meet all the nutritional needs, and particularly that impacts nutritionally vulnerable groups. And I've shown you different examples of how to make most of what is provided and how to make linkages with other systems and their interventions, so as to maximize the support for food security and nutrition. Thank you very much. Back over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Saskia. And as folks might know, the World Food Program, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this kind of response work that has turned the data that Yacob and Maximo talked about into actionable response on the ground. And now we'll hear from Rob Bertram about how to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And Rob will share his long experience and current guidance of USAID in prevention as well as response.
Thanks very much, Will, and thanks to CFAIR for convening us. I'm going to be focusing, as it says, on food security, nutrition, resilience, really the human face of what we're talking about here. But I hope to do this in a way that also speaks to some other global challenges that we face around, for example, environment and climate. So let's go to the next slide, please. So why are we talking about agriculture here? Why am I going to be talking about agriculture? Well, as you can see by that top line, it is the source of more food. It has raced ahead of population growth in the recent decades, starting with the Green Revolution. It makes food more affordable. Look at that blue line that has come down although up and down, has come down over time. And that has the effect of making food more affordable every day, and the poorer you are, the more impact that has on your well-being, both in terms of food, but also, for example, having money for healthcare, school fees, investment in your farm or other enterprise. And then there's a very important line at the bottom of this graph, and that shows that all of this increase in production, tripling, quadrupling, has occurred with very little increase in land area. And we're going to come back to that, but that's a very important fact to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So in agriculture and food, we can't stand still. Pests and diseases evolve. we have climate change facing us, and we have demand actually racing ahead of population growth. And so what we see, fortunately, in the developing world, where this graph represents, is in this last 60 years, a shift from almost all increase coming from increased inputs, fertilizer, water, energy, and now in recent years, almost all the growth increasing due to knowledge, better genetics, better decision-making by farmers, better management of soil, water, better knowledge about markets, increased market efficiency, reduced post-harvest losses. All of these are growing that environmentally friendly growth that's really feeding the world at this point. And this is even more pronounced in developed countries. The next slide, please. So let's take a look at some examples. First, from Asia. We see this divergence between environmentally friendly growth and input-led growth taking off about the year 2000. And then look what happens on the right side of the graph to extreme poverty, going down by half, by 60% to 30%. Food insecurity going from 20% to 10% of the population. Acutely food insecure, I'm sorry, 40 to 20. So very, very fast, and also child stunting going down rapidly in this same period, not rapidly as much as we'd like. And child stunting, by the way, is a marker for chronic food insecurity. It's not just about food, it's also about healthcare and clean water and sanitation, but food is critical. So without the food, those other factors will not allow a child to thrive. And it makes a child more susceptible to disease, and it affects his or her economic potential as well as their stature and growth into adulthood. The next slide, please. So let's look at an example here from Africa with Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a same story in many ways. Starting about the year 2000 or 2005, we see this rapid increase. We see inputs going up too, and that's a story we'll say more about, but it's because Africa was using such low levels of fertilizer, and Ethiopia changed that in ways that doubled and tripled crop yields. But that also potentiated the adoption of new varieties, better techniques by farmers, more environmentally friendly management practices, climate smart practices, all of which are adding to this environmentally friendly growth. And then on the right side, we see the same kind of gains with particularly fast declines in the extreme poor under $1.90 a day, and also in the food insecure going from 30 to 10% in the space of 15 or 20 years. This is extraordinary. This is basically an African green revolution, but the problem, I'm sorry to say, is that we can't point to other examples as frequently as we'd like across Africa. So let's take a look at this next slide, please. Now here we see this total factor productivity, this environmentally friendly growth, doubling or tripling in terms of its importance across the developing world if we compare the first 30 years of the Green Revolution and then what's happened since 1990. So that's a tremendous win for the environment, for food security, and for poverty reduction, because it makes food more affordable without using more inputs and less land. But look, unfortunately, sub-Saharan Africa is not following the same trajectory nearly as quickly. And we know that in the last 20 years, 3/4 of all the growth in food production in Africa came from using more land. That's not poverty reducing, that's not food security improving, and unfortunately, it's not climate change or environmentally sustainable. So that needs to change. Next slide, please. So how do we tackle this? And I know this is a busy slide, and let's start on the right. That's showing in the typical farming systems, this one from West Africa, where you see the pink shading is food insecure, the green is food secure. And you see this huge bulk of low income, smallholder farm families with very poor incomes, 1 ton or less per hectare of a maize or sorghum or millet. And what we see though is that if people make decisions to make changes, adopting better agronomy, and then adopting fertilizer, and then considering diversification into poultry or to vegetables or some other higher value fish, other higher value product, they can actually move up that staircase. And this is happening. And of course, once you move up to 2.5 tons per hectare, we find that people have other options off farm because of that agricultural growth that these higher yields are driving. So it's driving demand from farm families, but also from dressmakers and shoemakers and bicycle repairmen and all kinds of people. So this is that resilient growth that we're looking for to really change the trajectory. But we see here that it really does require diversification, but that also requires keeping those yields high of the main staples. So next slide, just a few more comments here. Why is getting the food and poverty reduction so critical? Because people, in order to afford a quality diet, food has to be affordable based on productivity gains and efficient markets and reduced losses, but also people have to have money to buy it. And these kinds of investments do both. And we know still that 3 billion people can't afford that nationally recommended diet, which is similar to the Lancet diet. Next slide, please. So nutrition is a key outcome here. And then let's keep in mind that context matters. Look at sub-Saharan Africa. It's the bottom line in terms of fertilizer consumption. So what works, what we do in Asia and Latin America or the Middle East is quite different from sub-Saharan Africa. So we need to keep that in mind. And in the next slide, we're going to get that same message, but this time with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. The 50 poorest countries collectively are the little orange line you can hardly see at the top of this CO2 chart, which captures emissions from industry and other kinds of things. But most of the countries that are in deep poverty in these farming systems in Africa and some parts of South Asia, these are not major emitters of greenhouse gas reduction. Next slide, please. And then we also know that if we get agricultural growth right, it actually reduces by millions and millions of hectares the amount of land needed. And ideally, in the view of many leading scientists, we want to turn the clock back and actually have some land go back to nature, hillsides, wetlands, other fragile spaces that are rich in biodiversity. And the final slide is just to say that we need to see food security challenges and nutrition challenges in a lens that also has the environment and biodiversity. Remember, this is the largest footprint of our species in the world, and also around climate change. Being efficient, bending the curve, using resources wisely, but also sparing wetlands, forests, hillsides, so that there are rich carbon sinks and biodiversity habitat. Thank you so much.